The abrasive scent of industrial bleach and scorched chicory coffee was supposed to be suffocating. But for the last 4 years, it had been the exact smell of my sanctuary. I pressed the damp, frayed rag into the cracked red vinyl of the diner booth, dragging it across a stubborn stain of dried ketchup. The friction of the coarse cloth against the vinyl produced a high-pitched squeak that cut through the low, ambient hum of the commercial refrigerators. Outside the frosted, single-pane windows, a blinding white squall was actively erasing the remote mountain town of Whitefish, Montana, from the map. The wind howled, rattling the glass in its loose wooden frame, throwing heavy sheets of ice against the building. I didn't mind the storm. The storm meant the highway passes were closed. It meant the snowplows wouldn't make it up the winding incline of Route 93 for at least another 6 hours. It meant we were cut off from the rest of the world. I wiped down the chrome edge of the table, my knuckles white, the skin cracked and bleeding at the cuticles from the dry air and endless hand-washing. I paused, keeping my head bowed, and let my eyes slide toward the far end of the diner. Booth number 7. The one positioned directly next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen, entirely obscured from the front windows. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the faded upholstery. She was wearing a thick, oversized yellow knitted sweater that swallowed her small frame, the sleeves rolled up twice so her hands could reach the scattered crayons on the table. She had a piece of standard-issue diner placemat paper flipped over, meticulously coloring the blank side. She didn't color like other 4-year-olds, utilizing frantic, chaotic scribbles. She held the black crayon with a terrifyingly precise, measured grip, tracing sharp, geometric lines with a steady cadence that always made a phantom chill trace the length of my spine. I turned away from booth 7, tossing the damp rag into the gray plastic bussing tub. The diner was entirely empty. The lunch rush had died 3 hours ago when the state troopers issued the blizzard warning. Old man Henderson, the owner and line cook, had retreated to the back office to nurse a bottle of cheap bourbon and listen to the static-drowned local radio station. It was just me, Lily, and the rhythmic ticking of the analog clock above the pie case. I walked behind the counter, reaching beneath the register. My fingertips grazed the rough, textured grip of the snub-nosed 38 special secured to the underside of the wood with heavy industrial duct tape. The metal was freezing cold. I didn't pull it out, I just touched it. A grounding mechanism. A physical reminder that I was no longer the terrified, paralyzed girl who had fled a sprawling compound in Sinaloa in the dead of night. The bell above the heavy glass entrance door chimed. The sound was instantly swallowed by a violent rush of freezing air, carrying the scent of diesel exhaust, ozone, and wet asphalt. My hand jerked away from the underside of the counter. I wiped my palms on my faded denim apron, forcing my spine into a rigid, professional line. Kitchen's closed, I called out, keeping my voice pitched low, aiming for the weary apathy of a rural waitress closing up shop. Coffee and pie only until the plow clears the main. The words died in my throat. The vocal cords completely seized, refusing to vibrate. 2 men stepped over the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the blizzard. The immediate drop in acoustic interference plunged the diner into a suffocating, pressurized silence. They did not look like stranded motorists. They did not wear heavy Carhartt gear, or snow boots. They wore tailored, dark wool overcoats that absorbed the harsh fluorescent lighting of the diner. The man in the front was built like a freight train, his broad shoulders stretching the expensive fabric of his coat. A thick, jagged scar pulled the left corner of his mouth into a permanent, mocking sneer. His eyes, dark and entirely devoid of human empathy, swept the empty diner in a fluid, practiced tactical assessment. He didn't look at the pie case. He didn't look at the menu board. He looked at the exits. Diego. The blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. The walls of the diner seemed to violently warp inward, compressing the oxygen in the room until my lungs burned. 4 years of meticulously crafted paranoia. 4 years of looking over my shoulder at every passing dark sedan. Dissolved in a fraction of a second, I couldn't breathe. My hands, resting on the Formica counter, began a microscopic, uncontrollable tremor. Diego's eyes finished their sweep and locked onto my face. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply took a step to the side, carving out a path in the entryway. A third man stepped into the diner. The ambient temperature in the room did not change, but the physical sensation of freezing to death washed over me. He moved with a slow, languid grace, completely unaffected by the sub-zero storm he had just walked out of. He unbuttoned the collar of his bespoke cashmere coat, the dark fabric a stark contrast against his olive skin. His dark hair was impeccably styled, catching the faint light as he slowly tilted his head, taking in the dilapidated surroundings with a microscopic tightening of his jaw. Matteo Cardenas. The architect of my nightmares. The man whose whisper commanded armies, whose displeasure resulted in mass graves, and whose ring I had slipped off my finger and left on a marble vanity before I vanished into the dark. He didn't look at Diego. He didn't look at the empty booths. He looked directly at me. His eyes were exactly as I remembered them. Bottomless, abyssal voids of obsidian that held no reflection. They were the eyes of a man who evaluated the world strictly through the lens of possession and destruction. He began to walk toward the counter. The rhythmic, heavy click of his leather-soled shoes against the linoleum floor echoed in the silent room. Each step was a hammer, striking the anvil of my pulse. I commanded my hand to move back under the counter, to reach for the taped revolver, but the neural pathways were severed by pure, unadulterated terror. My body recognized the apex predator, and millions of years of evolutionary biology ordered me to remain perfectly, invisibly still. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the counter. The smell of his cologne, expensive vetiver, crushed cedar, and a faint, metallic undertone of cold air breached the scent of the diner's bleach. It was a suffocatingly familiar scent. He stared at my face. He studied the dark circles under my eyes, the cheap, poorly dyed brown hair pulled into a messy knot at the nape of my neck, the rough, cracked skin of my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Maya, Matteo murmured. The sound of my real name falling from his lips was a physical violation. It vibrated against my collarbone. It stripped away the identity of Chloe, the quiet single mother from Oregon. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared at the knot of his dark silk tie, unable to meet those bottomless eyes. Matteo leaned forward, resting one gloved hand on the formica counter. The leather creaked softly in the quiet room. 4 years. He said, his voice a low, smooth vibration, utterly devoid of the frantic, kinetic rage I had anticipated. 4 years, a dozen burned aliases, and millions of dollars spent tracing ghost accounts through 3 different countries. Only to find you serving stale coffee in a wooden shack at the edge of the world. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to the faded name tag pinned to my apron. Chloe, he read, a dark, humorless amusement flickering in his tone. A rather pedestrian choice, mi amor. I expected more from the woman who managed to bypass my central security grid. My right hand finally twitched, sliding a fraction of an inch toward the edge of the counter. Diego shifted his weight by the door. The heavy rustle of his wool coat a clear, definitive warning. He hadn't drawn a weapon, but the kinetic potential in his massive frame was a loaded gun pointed directly at my chest. Matteo raised his ungloved left hand. A minute, dismissive gesture toward his enforcer. Diego instantly froze. We are not here to create a spectacle, Matteo said softly, his eyes dragging back up to mine. I simply came to collect what belongs to me. I don't belong to you, I rasped, the words tearing through my paralyzed throat like broken glass. My voice sounded foreign, thin and reedy. Matteo's jaw flexed, a microscopic tightening of the muscle beneath his cheekbone. It was the only tell. The only sign that beneath the immaculate, controlled exterior, a terrifying violence was boiling. You misunderstand the nature of our arrangement, Maya, he whispered, leaning in closer until the heat of his breath brushed against my temple. You have always belonged to me. Your departure was merely an unauthorized vacation. A temporary lapse in judgment that I am willing to forgive, given the circumstances. He pulled back slightly, his eyes drifting past my shoulder, scanning the length of the diner behind the counter. My heart completely stopped beating. He was looking toward the back, toward the swinging kitchen doors, toward booth number 7. I was informed, Matteo continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken register, that you did not leave Sinaloa empty-handed. I slammed my hands flat onto the counter, the sudden, loud smack echoing sharply. I don't know what you're talking about. I lied, the denial explosive and desperate. I left with nothing. I have nothing. It's just me. Matteo's eyes snapped back to my face. The amusement was gone. The dark voids narrowed, analyzing the sudden spike in my pulse, the erratic shift in my breathing, the sheer, animalistic panic bleeding out of my pores. He recognized the shift. He knew exactly what it meant. He didn't argue. He didn't press the interrogation. He simply bypassed me. He stepped away from the counter, his leather shoes clicking against the linoleum as he began to walk slowly down the central aisle of the diner, moving toward the back booths. "Stop!" I gasped, throwing myself around the edge of the counter, my boots skidding on the damp floor. I lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of his expensive cashmere coat. Matteo stopped instantly. He didn't pull away. He slowly turned his head, looking down at my small, cracked hand gripping his coat with white-knuckled desperation. Diego moved. In a blur of motion that defied his massive size, the enforcer crossed the diner, his heavy hand clamping down on my shoulder with bone-crushing force, violently ripping me away from Matteo. I slammed backward against the edge of a booth, the breath exploding from my lungs in a sharp grunt. "Diego," Matteo said, the single word a quiet, absolute command. Diego immediately released me, taking a step back, but his dark eyes remained locked on my face, promising death if I moved again. I leaned against the vinyl booth, gasping for air, clutching my bruised shoulder. Matteo adjusted the cuff of his coat, smoothing the fabric where I had grabbed it. He didn't look at me anymore. He turned his attention back to the rear of the diner. He walked past booth 5, past booth 6. He stopped at booth 7. The silence in the diner was absolute. A heavy, suffocating vacuum. The only sound was the howling of the blizzard crashing against the frosted windows. I pushed off the booth, ignoring Diego's warning glare, and stumbled forward until I could see the back of Matteo's coat. Matteo stood perfectly still, looking down at the table. Lily had not looked up. She was completely absorbed in her drawing, her small hand moving the black crayon in precise, deliberate strokes across the paper. She was humming a low, tuneless melody, entirely isolated in her own world, oblivious to the apex predator standing inches away from her. Matteo didn't speak. He slowly reached out, his hand hovering over the table. He picked up one of the scattered crayons. Not the bright red or the vibrant blue. He picked up the charcoal gray. He rolled the wax cylinder between his long fingers, watching the child color. "You grip the instrument with excessive tension," Matteo murmured, his voice completely stripped of its lethal edge, dropping into a tone I had only ever heard him use in the dead of night, behind the locked doors of our compound. Lily stopped humming. The crayon in her hand halted its movement. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up in surprise. She slowly turned her small head, lifting her gaze from the paper. She looked at the immaculate cuff of his coat, the expensive watch peeking out from beneath the fabric, and finally, up to his face. The physical resemblance was a violent, undeniable collision of genetics. The heavy, dark lashes, the sharp, aristocratic angle of the cheekbones, and the eyes, the exact, bottomless voids of obsidian, possessing an ancient, analytical depth that did not belong in the face of a 4-year-old child. Matteo stared at her. The breathing in his chest hitched a microscopic, almost imperceptible falter in his flawless control. His hand, holding the gray crayon, slowly lowered to the table. He was looking at a mirror. He was looking at his own ghost, reborn and hidden in the snow. "What are you drawing?" Matteo asked softly. Lily blinked slowly, evaluating the stranger with the exact same cold, calculated detachment he used to evaluate his enemies. She looked down at her paper, then back up at him. "A cage," Lily answered, her high, clear voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "But the lines are broken. So the bird can get out." Matteo's jaw locked. A profound, terrifying understanding passed between the cartel leader and the 4-year-old child. He saw the architecture of his own mind operating within her skull. I couldn't watch it anymore. The biological tether connecting them in that moment was a physical wire I needed to sever. I pushed past Diego, ignoring the lethal threat of the enforcer, and threw myself between Matteo and the booth. I placed my body squarely in front of Lily, pushing her small frame back against the vinyl upholstery, shielding her entirely from his line of sight. "Don't look at her," I hissed, the adrenaline finally overriding the terror, my voice vibrating with a feral, maternal rage. "Don't you dare look at her." Matteo's eyes slowly rose from where Lily had been sitting, locking onto my face. The brief vulnerability I had witnessed a second ago was gone, replaced by a cold, consuming fury that threatened to incinerate the entire building. "She has my eyes, Maya," Matteo stated, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the linoleum. "She has my temperament. She is Cardena's blood." "No," I spat, my hands gripping the edge of the table behind me to keep from collapsing. "Do not lie to me," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, the sheer, gravitational weight of his authority pressing down on my lungs. "You stole my air. You stole 5 years of my legacy. You hid her in the dirt like a rat. She's not yours." The scream tore from my throat, raw and desperate, echoing violently off the tin ceiling of the diner. The silence that followed was deafening. Matteo did not blink. He stared at me, analyzing the frantic, hysterical denial vibrating in my chest. He looked at my white-knuckled grip on the table, the sweat beading at my hairline despite the freezing temperature, the absolute, cornered animal panic in my eyes. He slowly reached up, his fingers brushing the lapel of his cashmere coat. "If she is not mine, Maya," Matteo whispered, a dark, terrifying smile slowly curving the corner of his mouth, "then why are you shaking?" The dark, terrifying smile remained carved into the corner of his mouth, a micro-expression that did not disturb the absolute, freezing stillness of his obsidian eyes. He didn't demand an answer to his question. He let it hang in the suffocating air, a physical weight pressing down on my collarbone, utilizing the silence as a weapon. He knew. The lie I had screamed was a fragile glass shield shattering against a titanium wall. The heavy, rhythmic drumming of the blizzard against the frosted windows seemed to amplify. The wind shrieking through the poorly insulated eaves of the diner. The scent of scorched chicory coffee drifting from the unmonitored bun machine behind the counter grew acrid, burning the back of my throat, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from his face. Matteo slowly withdrew his hand from his lapel. He didn't reach for me. He didn't attempt to push past my body to get to the child sitting behind me. He took a slow, deliberate step backward. The movement was not a retreat. It was an expansion of his territory. He moved with the languid, predatory grace of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, sliding into the opposite side of booth number 7. The cracked red vinyl groaned under his weight. He unbuttoned his bespoke cashmere coat with one hand, letting the heavy fabric drape over the back of the seat, revealing the dark, tailored wool suit underneath. He crossed his legs, resting his ankle on his knee. He folded his hands on the formica table, directly across from the space where Lily's crayons lay scattered. "Sit, Maya," he instructed. The command was delivered at a conversational volume, stripped of any forceful inflection, yet it carried the undeniable, gravitational pull of the cartel's apex. I remained standing, my spine pressed rigidly against the edge of the table, my arms still spread backward in a desperate, primitive barrier. The rough denim of my apron felt heavy, soaked with the cold sweat trickling down my sides. "I prefer to stand," I managed to say. The vibration in my vocal cords felt erratic, a jagged frequency that betrayed the chaotic hammering against my ribs. Matteo tilted his head, a microscopic fraction of an inch. His gaze drifted from my face, sliding past my shoulder, aiming directly at the small, quiet presence hidden behind my legs. "The child is observing your erratic heart rate," he murmured, his tone analytical, dissecting the biology of the room. "You are projecting instability. It is an inefficient method of providing security. Sit down before your legs surrender to the adrenaline crash." I didn't move. At the front of the diner, the heavy, metallic scrape of the deadbolt locking echoed sharply. I whipped my head toward the entrance. Diego was standing by the heavy glass door. He had turned the brass lock, sealing the exit. He reached up, his massive, scarred hands grabbing the plastic cords of the cheap aluminum blinds. With a sharp, synchronized yank, the blinds crashed down, cutting off the pale, gray light of the blizzard outside. The diner was instantly plunged into the harsh, artificial glow of the overhead fluorescent tubes. The perimeter was closed. The terrarium was sealed. Diego didn't return to the counter. He took a position by the front register, crossing his massive arms over his chest, his dark eyes scanning the empty booths, ensuring the physical isolation of the space was absolute. I slowly turned back to booth 7. Matteo was still watching me, his hands resting on the table, entirely unbothered by the sudden enclosure. He was waiting. The tendons in my knees began to tremble, a violent, involuntary vibration that threatened to buckle my posture exactly as he had predicted. If I collapsed, I would expose Lily entirely. I moved mechanically, I slid my left foot backward, keeping my body angled, and slowly lowered myself onto the edge of the vinyl bench, pressing my hip against Lily's small, still form. I kept my right arm draped over her, pulling her close to my side. Lily did not resist the sudden, forceful embrace. She remained perfectly rigid against my ribs. She didn't look at me. Her pale face was turned toward the center of the table, her ice-cold, analytical gaze locked onto the man sitting across from us. Matteo didn't acknowledge the defensive maneuver. He simply observed the child. She does not possess your frantic energy, Matteo noted, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum that barely disturbed the air between us. He reached out, his long, manicured finger tracing the edge of the placemat where Lily had been drawing the broken cage. When the enforcer locked the door, your pulse spiked. Your pupils dilated. The child did not blink. Her breathing remained completely synchronized. He slowly raised his eyes, locking them onto mine, the dark void swirling with a terrifying, absolute recognition. She is evaluating the shift in power, he continued, the subtext heavy and suffocating. She understands that the frantic bird cannot protect her from the snake. So, she studies the snake. Stop analyzing my daughter, I hissed, the words scraping through a dry throat. She's a 4-year-old child. She's terrified. A dark, humorless chuckle vibrated deep in his chest. It was a sound that belonged to the sprawling, sun-baked courtyards of Sinaloa, completely alien to the freezing isolation of Montana. She is many things, Maya, but terrified is not one of them. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance across the narrow table. The scent of vetiver and cold cedar intensified, a phantom hand wrapping around my throat. Do you remember the night you left? My lungs seized. The air in the diner turned to solid ice. I didn't answer. I focused on a microscopic tear in the red vinyl near his elbow. It was raining. Matteo recalled, his tone deceptively gentle, narrating a memory that had haunted my every waking second for 48 months. A sudden, violent squall off the coast. The security grid experienced a localized failure in the western quadrant. A rolling blackout lasting exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He paused, letting the precise timing hang in the air, a surgical blade cutting through the silence. You walked out the service entrance. You, he continued, his eyes mapping every tremor in my jawline, every shallow, panicked hitch in my chest. You carried a single duffel bag. You wore the dark wool coat I purchased for you in Paris. And you slipped into the back of a refrigerated transport truck driven by a man named Arturo. The name hit me like a physical blow. Arturo. The logistics manager. For the Western Corridor. The man who had seen the bruises on my arms, who had watched me slowly wither in the golden cage, and who had finally, desperately agreed to smuggle me out. Arturo had promised me the blind spots. He had promised me the ghost routes. Arturo was a brave man, I whispered, the defiance cracking, bleeding into a sudden, raw grief. I had spent 4 years believing my freedom had cost a good man his life in a shallow desert grave. Matteo's jaw shifted, a slow, deliberate movement. Arturo is a highly compensated man, Matteo corrected smoothly. The words didn't compute immediately. They hung in the air, static noise against the drumming of the blizzard. What? I breathed. My grip on Lily's sweater tightening instinctively. Matteo leaned back, resting his shoulders against the vinyl, a portrait of absolute, unbothered control. Did you honestly believe? He began, the silken edges of his voice peeling back to reveal the cold, hard steel of the Cartel architect, that a mid-level logistics coordinator with a gambling debt to the Tijuana syndicate managed to bypass my central security architecture? Did you believe a 4-minute blackout was a fortunate coincidence of weather? The floor beneath my boots seemed to dissolve. The diner, the blizzard, the 4 years of agonizing, hypervigilant survival, began to violently warp and twist. No. I choked out, shaking my head, a frantic, desperate denial of the reality he was rapidly constructing. He hid me. He drove me to the border. He gave me the contact for the passports. He hid me. I authorized the blackout, Maya. The confession dropped like a concrete block, shattering the foundation of my entire existence. Mateo reached into the inner pocket of his cashmere coat. The movement was slow, deliberate, ensuring Diego didn't misinterpret the action. He pulled out a small, folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper. He didn't open it. He simply slid it across the formica table, stopping exactly halfway between us. I authorized the transport vehicle, Mateo continued, his eyes never leaving my face, watching the psychological hemorrhage with cold, clinical fascination. I provided Arturo with the routing numbers for the ghost accounts you used to purchase the Chloe identity in Oregon. I monitored the transaction when you bought the rusted Subaru you drove across the state line. Why? The question tore from my throat, a ragged, bleeding sound. The air in the diner was entirely gone. I was suffocating on the fumes of my own manufactured reality. If he knew. If he had engineered the escape. Why let me run? Why let me spend 4 years believing I was a ghost, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow, shivering in the freezing winters of the north? Mateo's gaze drifted from my face, dropping to the small child pressed rigidly against my side. Because. He murmured, his voice dropping to a frequency that vibrated with a terrifying, absolute possession. A pregnant woman attempting to flee the cartel presents a volatile physiological risk. The stress, the erratic movements, the potential for a panicked, fatal error. It was an unacceptable risk to the biology she was incubating. My vision blurred, a dark vignette creeping into the periphery. The roaring in my ears drowned out the storm outside. You were a frantic, caged bird, Maya, he said, perfectly echoing the drawing Lily had made. You were damaging yourself against the bars. I calculated that the safest incubator for my heir was a woman who believed she had successfully escaped. A woman motivated by survival. So, I opened the door. I let the bird fly to a controlled environment, where she would prioritize the health of the child above all else. I stared at the folded cream paper on the table. The edges were perfectly crisp. You knew, I whispered, the complete and total annihilation of my agency rendering my voice hollow. Every day. Every town. Every job. You are exceptionally resilient. Mateo acknowledged, a dark, twisted compliment that made bile rise in my throat. You moved efficiently. You avoided the major surveillance grids. You built a quiet, unremarkable life. It was a flawless incubation period. He tapped the folded paper with his index finger. But the incubation period is over. Pour. A heavy, sudden thud echoed from the back of the diner. The heavy wooden door of the back office, located just past the swinging metal doors of the kitchen, swung open on its rusted hinges. Old man Henderson stepped out into the narrow hallway leading to the diner floor. He was a large man, his shoulders rounded from decades of bending over a flat-top grill, wearing a grease-stained white apron over a faded flannel shirt. He held a half-empty bottle of Maker's Mark by the neck in his left hand, his face flushed, his brow furrowed in a deep, aggressive scowl. He hadn't heard the conversation over the storm and the radio in his office, but he had felt the shift in the atmospheric pressure. He recognized the heavy silence that had replaced the low hum of the refrigerators. Chloe? Chloe. Henderson's voice boomed, thick with cheap bourbon and rural irritation. He took a heavy step out of the hallway, his boots scuffing the linoleum. Who closed the damn blinds? I told you we stay open until the plow. Henderson stopped. He cleared the hallway and stepped onto the main floor. His bleary eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting, instantly locking onto the massive silhouette of Diego standing guard by the locked front door. The old man's posture changed. The irritation evaporated, instantly replaced by the primal, localized instinct of a civilian recognizing apex violence. He didn't know the men were cartel, but he saw the bespoke suits, the unblinking stares, the absolute, chilling stillness that did not belong in a Montana diner. Diego didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his weight, rotating his broad shoulders slightly to square off with the new variable. The heavy wool of his coat parted just enough to reveal the matte black grip of a holstered weapon sitting high on his hip. The temperature in the room plummeted. The delicate, psychological tension of the booth instantly weaponized into a kinetic threat. Mr. Henderson, go back to the office, I shouted, the words erupting from my chest before my brain could calculate the risk. I pushed myself up slightly from the vinyl bench, extending my hand toward the back of the room. Please. Just go back inside and lock the door. Henderson didn't move. He stood frozen by the kitchen doors, his grip on the bourbon bottle tightening until his knuckles turned stark white. His eyes darted from Diego, down the central aisle, landing on Mateo sitting calmly in booth 7. Who the hell are you people? Henderson demanded, his voice dropping, attempting to muster a territorial authority that was hopelessly outmatched. The diner is closed. You need to unlock that door and leave. Diego took a single, slow step down the aisle. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his boot against the linoleum sounded like a hammer cocking. Diego. Mateo's voice did not raise in volume. It remained a smooth, silken murmur, yet it sliced through the escalating tension with the precision of a scalpel. Diego stopped instantly, freezing mid-stride, a perfectly disciplined attack dog waiting for the tether to snap. Mateo didn't turn his head to look at the old man. He kept his dark eyes locked entirely on me, watching the desperate, frantic terror bleeding into my expression as I realized the bloodbath that was about to unfold in my sanctuary. We apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Henderson. Mateo spoke to the back of the room, his tone perfectly calibrated, dripping with an aristocratic, chilling politeness. The storm caught us unprepared on the pass. A cass. We merely sought refuge and a warm cup of coffee. I said we're closed, Henderson repeated, the bourbon giving him a false, fragile courage. He took a step forward, raising the bottle slightly. Chloe, get behind the counter. These boys are leaving. The air pressure vanished. I looked at Mateo's hands resting on the table. The long fingers remained perfectly still. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He didn't need to. He operated on a frequency of power that commanded death without moving a muscle. Please. I whispered, turning my attention entirely to the monster sitting across from me. Abandoning the old man. I leaned over the table, my chest brushing the cold formica, projecting my voice directly into Mateo's space. He doesn't know anything. He's just an old man. He gave me a job. Leave him out of this. Mateo's eyes dragged slowly over my face, analyzing the raw, naked desperation. He was weighing the variables. He was calculating the exact currency of my terror. I am a reasonable man, Maya, Mateo murmured, the ghost of that dark smile returning to the corner of his mouth. I do not seek unnecessary complications. But, he finally turned his head, looking over his shoulder down the long, empty aisle of the diner, locking his abyssal gaze onto the flushed face of the old cook. Mr. Henderson, Mateo called out, his voice smooth, echoing slightly off the tin ceiling. You purchased this establishment 7 years ago, utilizing a high-interest commercial loan from a regional bank in Missoula. A bank that, unfortunately, you are currently 4 months behind in paying. Henderson's jaw went slack. The false courage generated by the bourbon evaporated instantly, replaced by a profound, paralyzing confusion. The heavy bottle in his hand lowered slowly to his side. How do you? Henderson stammered, the words catching in a suddenly dry throat. Mateo turned back to the table. He reached out with a single finger and tapped the thick, cream-colored paper he had slid across the formica moments ago. Open it. Maya, Mateo instructed. My hand trembled violently as I reached out. My fingers brushed the cold, textured paper. I pulled it toward me and slowly unfolded the heavy document. The harsh fluorescent light caught the stark black ink of the legal phrasing. It was a deed of transfer, a commercial property acquisition. Buyer, Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Property, 1142, Highway 93 North, Whitefish, Montana. Date of transfer, 36 months ago. I stared at the date. 36 months ago. 1 year after I had arrived in this freezing, isolated town. 1 year after I had begged Henderson for a job waiting tables to feed my infant daughter. Vanguard Holdings. Mateo stated, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that dismantled the final, crumbling pillars of my sanity, is a subsidiary of a real estate conglomerate operating out of Mexico City. A conglomerate that I exclusively control. I couldn't breathe. The text on the page blurred into a meaningless swarm of black insects. I didn't just track your movements. Maya. Mateo whispered, leaning in closer, the scent of crushed cedar wrapping tightly around my lungs. I paved the road. When you struggled to find employment, I purchased the ground beneath your feet. I instructed the regional bank to apply localized pressure on Mr. Henderson, forcing him to accept a quiet buyout to avoid foreclosure. I ensured you remained exactly where I needed you to be. He reached out, his bare fingers brushing the frayed edge of my denim apron. You haven't been working for him, Matteo murmured, his eyes locking onto mine, possessing an absolute, terrifying totality. You have been working for me. This diner is my property. The roof over your head is my property. You have never, for a single second, stepped outside the boundaries of my cage. A high, thin ringing began in my ears. The complete erasure of my agency, the staggering, invisible architecture of his control, was too massive to comprehend. I had spent 4 years believing I was a survivor. I had scrubbed toilets, hauled firewood, and frozen in the dark, believing every hardship was the price of freedom. But it was all a curated exhibit, a terrarium built by a psychopath to safely house his pregnant prize until the asset was ready for extraction. I looked down at Lily. She was still pressed rigidly against my side. She hadn't looked at the deed. She hadn't looked at Henderson. Her pale, ice-gray eyes remained fixed on Matteo's face, studying the micro-expressions of the man who had just claimed ownership of her entire reality. She wasn't crying. She wasn't seeking comfort in my embrace. She slowly reached her small hand out, pushing past my protective arm, and picked up the black crayon she had dropped earlier. Matteo stopped looking at me. His attention snapped back to the child, tracking the movement of her hand with intense, clinical focus. Lily didn't resume drawing the broken cage. She flipped the placemat over, exposing the busy, printed side featuring a maze for children. She placed the tip of the black crayon at the entrance of the maze. End. She didn't trace the winding, correct path through the printed lines. She pressed the crayon down hard, the wax snapping slightly under the pressure, and drew a single, heavy, straight black line directly from the entrance, cutting through the printed walls, straight to the exit in the center. She lowered the crayon. She looked up at Matteo. The walls are just paper, Lily stated, her high, clear voice echoing the exact, chilling cadence of the cartel leader, sitting across from her. Matteo's breath stalled. A profound, absolute silence swallowed the diner. The old man by the kitchen doors, the massive enforcer by the entrance, the howling blizzard outside, everything faded into insignificance against the biological collision happening at booth 7. Matteo slowly reached across the table. He didn't reach for me. He bypassed the mother entirely. He extended his long, manicured hand, palm up, resting it on the cold formica, just inches from Lily's drawing. An offering. An invitation from the apex predator to the heir he had engineered from the shadows. Yes, Pequeña, Matteo whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute reverence. The walls are just paper. And it is time to burn them down. The space between his extended palm and her small fingers was perhaps 4 inches. It was a microscopic void of air, dust motes dancing lazily in the harsh fluorescent lighting, completely ignorant of the gravitational collapse occurring around them. His hand was flawless. The manicured nails, the smooth, olive skin, the faint blue veins mapping the back of his wrist. It was a hand that signed execution orders with custom gold fountain pens. Lily's hand, hovering just above the table, was smeared with black wax. She was looking at his palm not with affection, but with a cold, calculating curiosity. She was a child standing on the edge of a precipice, leaning over to see how deep the dark went. I didn't think. The higher functions of my brain, the logic, the paralyzing terror, the survival instinct were entirely overridden by a violent, primitive surge of biology. I threw my body weight forward. My right hand slammed down onto the formica table, covering Lily's hand completely, pinning it flat against the printed maze. The sudden, brutal impact snapped the remaining half of the black crayon she was holding. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the silent booth. I dragged her arm back, pulling her violently against my ribs, burying her face into the rough denim of my apron. She let out a small, sharp gasp of surprise, her small fists clenching against my stomach, but she didn't cry. My chest heaved, pulling in jagged, burning breaths of air that tasted of scorched coffee and copper. I stared across the table at the extended, empty hand. Matteo did not flinch. He didn't pull his hand back. He left his palm resting face up on the table, an open invitation that had been rudely intercepted. Slowly, deliberately, he curled his fingers inward, forming a loose, relaxed fist. He turned his wrist, resting his knuckles against the formica. He raised his eyes. The abyssal voids were no longer observing an experiment. They were focused entirely on the obstacle. "You are delaying the inevitable," Matteo whispered. The silken edges of his voice completely stripped away, leaving a harsh, metallic rasp that vibrated against my teeth. "You cannot overwrite the blood in her veins with cheap denim and diner food. Don't touch her." I choked out, my voice a feral, guttural snarl that I didn't recognize. "Hey! Hey! Hey! Hey!" The shout from the back of the room was sudden and entirely misplaced. It lacked the cold, calculated resonance of the cartel. It was loud, sloppy, and dripping with rural indignation. Old man Henderson had not retreated to the office. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots echoed down the linoleum aisle. I didn't look at him. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the apex predator sitting across from me, but my peripheral vision caught the dull, metallic glint catching the overhead lights. The unmistakable, heavy clack times of a pump-action shotgun racking a shell into the chamber shattered the fragile equilibrium of the diner. "I don't care what kind of fancy suits you boys are wearing," Henderson bellowed, his voice wavering slightly, betrayed by the adrenaline and the bourbon. He was standing 10 feet away, the barrel of the rusted Remington 870 leveled directly at the back of Matteo's cashmere coat. "You get out of my booth. You step away from Chloe. And you walk out that front door before I paint this linoleum with you." The air pressure in the room vanished. The ambient hum of the refrigerators seemed to abruptly cut out. Matteo did not turn around. He didn't even shift his gaze from my face. He looked at me, a profound, weary boredom settling over his sharp features. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, a microscopic sigh escaping his lips. "Diego," Matteo murmured. The word was not a shout. It was a casual dismissal of a nuisance. Diego moved. It was a terrifying violation of physics. A man of that immense, hulking mass should not possess the ability to cross distance without generating sound. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout a warning. He launched himself from the front register, his leather soles sliding silently over the damp floor. Henderson's eyes widened, tracking the sudden blur of motion. The old man panicked. His finger tightened on the heavy trigger. Diego didn't try to wrestle the barrel away. He didn't attempt to disarm the old man. He drove his shoulder directly into the center of the rusted barrel, absorbing the kinetic potential, his massive hand shooting out to grip the wooden pump mechanism, locking it in place. In the exact same fraction of a second, Diego's right hand, balled into a fist the size of a cinder block, piston forward. The impact was a sickening, wet crunch of cartilage and bone. Henderson didn't even have the opportunity to grunt. The sheer, blunt force trauma of Diego's knuckles connecting with his jawline lifted the heavy cook entirely off his feet. The shotgun clattered uselessly to the floor. Henderson slammed onto his back, his skull bouncing once against the hard linoleum with a hollow, terminal crack. The half-empty bottle of Maker's Mark he had dropped shattered violently, sending a wave of amber liquid and jagged glass sliding across the floor. He didn't move. He didn't twitch. A dark, thick pool of crimson immediately began to blossom from beneath his gray hair, mixing with the spilled bourbon. The entire violent exchange took less than 2 seconds. The silence that rushed back into the diner was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. I stopped breathing. My grip on Lily tightened until my fingers cramped, my nails digging into the thick yarn of her yellow sweater. Diego stood over the unmoving body, rolling his massive shoulders once, adjusting the cuff of his dark wool coat. He looked down at the blood spreading toward the toe of his expensive shoe, his face a mask of complete, sociopathic indifference. Matteo slowly uncrossed his legs under the table. He reached out, picking up a pristine white paper napkin from the chrome dispenser. He unfolded it deliberately, pressing it against a microscopic droplet of spilled coffee on his side of the table, absorbing the liquid with meticulous precision. "The tragedy of the rural American hero," Matteo mused, his voice drifting over the shattered glass and the bleeding man. "They watch too many moving pictures. They believe a rusted firearm compensates for a complete lack of tactical awareness. You He tossed the soiled napkin onto the red vinyl seat next to him. "Now," Matteo said, locking his obsidian eyes onto mine, "let us dispense with the theatrical interruptions. Bring the child around the table." The command was absolute. My nervous system violently rebelled. The paralyzing terror that had kept me pinned to the booth suddenly snapped, replaced by a blinding, white-hot surge of kinetic panic. I didn't slide out of the booth. I shoved my hands flat against the table, kicking my legs out, launching myself backward. I dragged Lily with me, throwing her small, light body under the heavy overhang of the chrome table. "Stay under the booth," I screamed, my voice shredding my throat. I hit the linoleum floor hard, my knees absorbing the impact, and scrambled frantically toward the gap behind the counter. My boots slipped on the damp floor, my hands tearing at the corners of the booths for leverage. Diego turned his massive head, his dark eyes tracking my frantic scramble. He took a slow, heavy step over Henderson's bleeding body. I dove behind the Formica counter, my shoulder crashing into the metal edge of the industrial sink. The sharp pain was a distant, muted static. I threw myself onto the rubber floor mats, sliding on my back until I was positioned directly beneath the cash register. My hands flew up, fingers desperately searching the underside of the thick wooden counter. Wood. Dried gum. Screws. There. The heavy, abrasive texture of industrial duct tape. I dug my fingernails into the edge of the silver tape, pulling with every ounce of frantic strength I possessed. The adhesive fought back, a loud, ripping sound tearing through the quiet diner. The heavy, snub-nosed 38 Special dropped directly into my open palm. The freezing metal felt like an electric shock. I wrapped both hands around the textured grip, pulling the hammer back with my thumb. The metallic click times echoed loudly in the confined space behind the counter. I didn't stay on the floor. I couldn't protect the booth from the floor. I kicked my legs under me and launched myself upward, rising above the edge of the Formica counter, the heavy barrel of the revolver extending forward, locking both of my elbows to stabilize the shaking. I aimed the weapon directly at the center of Matteo's chest. He had not moved. He was still sitting in booth 7, his back perfectly straight against the red vinyl. He was watching me. He didn't look at the gun trembling in my hands. He looked at my face, analyzing the feral, desperate animal he had pushed into the corner. Diego, halfway down the aisle, froze. His hand drifted slowly toward the lapel of his overcoat, his eyes locked onto the muzzle of my weapon. "Don't move!" I screamed, the gun jumping in my hands with the force of my own voice. "I swear to God, I will pull the trigger. Diego, keep your hands away from your coat." Diego didn't look at me. He looked at Matteo, waiting for the silent, microscopic command to execute the threat. Matteo slowly raised his right hand, a languid, dismissive wave directed at his enforcer. "Stand down, Diego," Matteo said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It lacked the sudden spike of adrenaline that should accompany looking down the barrel of a loaded firearm. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, steepling his long fingers together. "You forgot to take the safety off, Maya," Matteo murmured. I gasped, my eyes darting frantically to the side of the revolver. There was no safety on a 38 Special revolver. It was a psychological trap. A microscopic manipulation, designed to break my focus, for exactly 1/10 of a second. In that fractured millisecond of distraction, Matteo moved. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't draw a weapon. He stood up from the booth with a terrifying, explosive speed that completely defied the languid posture he had maintained. By the time my eyes snapped back to the center of his chest, he was no longer sitting in the booth. He was standing in the aisle. I jerked the trigger, my finger tightening with absolute, lethal intent. Before the hammer could drop, a heavy, devastating weight slammed down onto my wrists. Diego hadn't moved. Matteo had crossed the 10 feet of linoleum in a blur of bespoke wool and predatory kinetic energy. His left hand locked around my wrists, crushing the delicate bones together with a vice-like grip that forced a sharp, agonizing cry from my lungs. The barrel of the 38 was violently forced upward, pointing harmlessly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. His right hand shot out, his long fingers wrapping entirely around my throat. The air supply was instantly severed. He didn't lift me off the ground. He drove me backward. The small of my back crashed against the stainless steel edge of the pie case, the heavy glass rattling dangerously behind my head. He pressed his body against the front of the counter, leaning entirely over the formica, pinning me in place. The crushing pressure on my windpipe was absolute. I couldn't draw a breath. I couldn't scream. My hands, still gripping the heavy revolver, were pinned immovably above my head by his left hand. I thrashed violently, my boots kicking against the cabinetry, but it was like fighting a titanium pillar. Matteo's face was inches from mine. The bottomless, obsidian voids consumed my entire field of vision. The scent of vetiver and cedar was a suffocating physical weight. He wasn't angry. The terrifying, dark amusement had returned, a cold fire burning in the depths of his eyes. "You always possessed a dramatic flair," Matteo whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. A rusty revolver taped under a diner counter. It is almost poetic in its futility. He squeezed his hand around my throat a fraction of a millimeter tighter. The edges of my vision instantly began to turn gray, a dark static closing in on the periphery. "But you are fighting shadows. Mi amor," he continued, the silken words scraping against my eardrums. "You believe you are fighting a man who broke into your sanctuary. You do not understand that the sanctuary was built entirely of my own design." I choked, a wet, ragged sound escaping my lips, desperately trying to twist my head to break the pressure on my carotid artery. Matteo slowly reached his thumb up, pressing it precisely against the erratic, hammering pulse point under my jaw. "Do you know why I let you run?" he asked, the question hanging in the suffocating silence. He didn't wait for me to answer. He didn't need to. "Because a captive bird constantly tests the bars." "Bars?" he murmured, his face drifting closer until his lips brushed the shell of my ear. "A captive bird focuses entirely on the architecture of the cage. But a bird that believes she has escaped the cage. She focuses on building a nest. She focuses on the egg." He pulled his face back, locking his gaze back onto my terrifyingly wide, oxygen-starved eyes. "I needed you to believe you were safe," he whispered. "I needed your body to relax, to lower its cortisol levels, to provide the perfect, stress-free biological environment for the air you were carrying. So, I engineered the illusion." The dark static in my vision pulsed, threatening to pull me entirely into unconsciousness. "Arturo did not betray me," Matteo stated, dismantling the final, desperate hope I clung to. "Arturo is my cousin. A blood relative. He is currently sitting in the driver's seat of the SUV parked outside this building, keeping the engine warm." A silent, agonizing sob tore through my chest. Arturo. The man who had held my hand in the rain. The man who had given me the keys to the rusted Subaru. The man who had handed me a map with a single red circle drawn around a remote town in Montana. "Drive north. Don't stop until the snow covers your tracks. There is a town called Whitefish." It was a script. Every word of comfort, every desperate, hurried instruction was a carefully curated line fed to him by the architect of my nightmare. "He guided you here," Matteo continued, systematically pulling apart the fabric of my sanity. "He chose this town because it is isolated. The harsh winters limit mobility. The limited population allows for easy, absolute surveillance. I bought this diner. I bought the regional bank. I bought the local sheriff, a man named Miller, who sends me a weekly digital report detailing your movements, your grocery purchases, and the developmental milestones of my daughter." My grip on the heavy revolver slackened. The weapon suddenly felt entirely useless. A child's toy against a localized deity. I hadn't escaped the cartel. I had simply moved into a remote, heavily monitored terrarium. Every breath of freezing mountain air I had taken for the last 4 years was permitted only because Matteo Cardenas allowed it. Every smile I had shared with Lily in this booth was recorded, logged, and filed in a server in Mexico. "You thought you were a survivor," Matteo whispered, the absolute cruelty of the truth destroying the final vestiges of my resistance. "But you were simply a biological courier. And the package has reached maturation." He abruptly released the crushing grip on my throat. I collapsed instantly, my knees buckling as the oxygen violently rushed back into my lungs. I hit the rubber floor mats hard, dropping the revolver. It clattered against the stainless steel base of the pie case. I gasped, violent, ragged coughs tearing through my chest, my hands clutching my bruised throat. Mateo stepped back from the counter, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, entirely unbothered by the violence he had just inflicted. "Diego," Mateo commanded. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the enforcer approached the counter. "Secure the weapon," Mateo instructed, not looking down at me. "And retrieve the child from beneath the booth." "Ja." The words acted as a defibrillator, sending a massive, agonizing jolt of pure maternal panic straight into my heart. The horror of the betrayal, the crushing realization of my invisible cage, evaporated, entirely replaced by the singular, primal imperative to protect my blood. "No!" I screamed, the sound tearing my ruined throat. I scrambled on the floor mats, my bloody fingers desperately reaching for the discarded .38 revolver. A heavy, leather-soled boot slammed down onto the back of my hand, pinning it flat against the rubber mat with bone-crushing pressure. I cried out, twisting my body, but Diego leaned his massive weight onto his leg, trapping me completely. The enforcer bent down, his massive hand effortlessly scooping the heavy revolver off the floor. He tucked it into the pocket of his overcoat, not even bothering to look at me. "Leave her alone," I sobbed, thrashing violently against the floor, ignoring the agonizing pain in my crushed hand. "She doesn't know you. You'll terrify her." Mateo stood in the center aisle, watching Diego walk toward booth 7. "She is Cardenas," Mateo repeated, his voice echoing in the silent diner. "She does not fear the dark. She belongs in it." Diego reached the booth. He didn't bend down immediately. He stood looking at the empty red vinyl, analyzing the shadows beneath the table. "Come out," Diego's gravelly voice ordered. "Lie. Lie. Lie." It was not a request. It was the bark of a handler to a dog. "Silence." I twisted my neck, trying to see under the counter, desperate to catch a glimpse of the heavy yellow sweater. "Lily, don't move," I screamed, tears streaming down my face, mixing with the dust on the floor mats. "Don't come out." Diego crouched down, his massive frame blocking my line of sight entirely. He reached his heavy arm under the table. I waited for the scream. I waited for the frantic, panicked thrashing of a 4-year-old child being grabbed by a monster in the dark. It never came. Diego stood up slowly. He was holding Lily. He didn't have her slung over his shoulder. He hadn't dragged her out by her arm. He was holding her carefully, effortlessly supporting her small weight on his massive forearm. Lily was not crying. She was not struggling. She sat perfectly still on the enforcer's arm, her small hands resting quietly in her lap. Her oversized yellow sweater was covered in dust from the floor, but her face was a mask of absolute, chilling serenity. She looked at the blood pooling around Henderson's body. She looked at me, pinned to the floor behind the counter, weeping hysterically, my face bruised and covered in dirt. And then, she turned her head and looked directly at Mateo. Mateo stood in the aisle, his dark eyes locked onto the small child held by his enforcer. The resemblance was horrifying. The same posture, the same unblinking, analytical stare. It was a genetic mirror reflecting the darkest parts of the human soul. Mateo slowly raised his hand, extending his long fingers toward her face. I fought wildly against Diego's boot, a desperate, dying animal thrashing against a steel trap. "Don't touch her." I shrieked, the sound echoing hollowly off the acoustic ceiling tiles. "She's mine. She's all I have." Mateo's fingers gently grazed Lily's cheek. The child didn't flinch. She didn't pull away from the cold touch of the apex predator. She simply tilted her small head, leaning slightly into his palm, a microscopic acknowledgement of the hierarchy. Mateo's jaw tightened. A profound, terrifying possession settled over his features. "You were merely the vessel, Maya," Mateo whispered, his voice carrying clearly over my frantic sobbing. He didn't look at me. His eyes were entirely consumed by the child. "The incubation is complete. The bloodline is secured." He turned his back on me. He began to walk toward the locked front doors of the diner, the heavy, rhythmic click of his shoes signaling the end of the world. Diego turned, carrying my entire universe on his arm, following the architect out of the slaughterhouse. The heavy, rhythmic tread of Diego's boots on the linoleum began to fade, moving steadily toward the front of the diner. The massive enforcer carried the weight of my entire universe on his forearm. Mateo followed, his bespoke cashmere coat whispering against his legs, the architect casually strolling out of the slaughterhouse he had just meticulously curated. I lay on the rubber floor mats. My face pressed against the damp, dust-caked rubber. The agonizing, localized pressure on the crushed metacarpals of my right hand throbbed in time with my frantic, erratic pulse. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, listening to the heavy brass latch of the front door click as Diego turned the deadbolt to unlock it. Diego pushed the heavy glass door. It didn't open. A heavy, metallic rattle echoed through the quiet diner. Diego pushed harder, his massive shoulder driving into the glass. The thick pane shuddered violently within its aluminum frame, but the door remained absolutely, immovably sealed. The latches jammed. Diego's gravelly voice grunted over the howling of the blizzard outside. He pulled back, examining the brass deadbolt. He twisted it again. It spun freely, completely disconnected from the internal locking mechanism. Mateo stopped. 2 feet behind his enforcer. He didn't look at the door. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes sweeping back down the central aisle of the diner. I opened my eyes. I stared at the dusty baseboard of the pie case. I drew in a slow, deep breath of the air, pulling the sharp scent of industrial bleach and scorched coffee deep into my lungs. I held the oxygen in my chest for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I executed the psychological amputation I had practiced in the dark every night for 48 months. I severed the frantic, hyperventilating terror of Chloe, the helpless single mother from Oregon. I dismantled the fragile, desperate waitress who flinched at loud noises and cowered behind Formica counters. I let her die on the rubber floor mat, a necessary casualty of the long game. I exhaled. My pulse instantly dropped, stabilizing into a slow, cold, mechanical rhythm. The burning agony in my crushed right hand vanished, the neural pathways deliberately shut down, compartmentalized behind a titanium wall of pure, focused intent. I planted my left hand on the floor and pushed myself up. I didn't scramble. I didn't tremble. I rose from the floor with a fluid, terrifyingly steady grace, my spine aligning into a rigid, perfect posture. I wiped a streak of dirt and blood from my chin with the back of my left wrist, my movements deliberate and entirely unhurried. I stepped out from behind the counter. Mateo was watching me. The dark amusement that had defined his features for the last hour was completely gone. His brow furrowed, a microscopic, sharp V forming between his eyes. He recognized the shift in the atmospheric pressure. He was an apex predator, and his biology had just detected a profound, sudden change in the ecosystem. The frantic, bleeding bird he had left thrashing on the floor was gone. The deadbolt is a dummy lock, Mateo, I stated. My voice was unrecognizable. The thin, reedy pitch of a terrified victim was entirely stripped away, replaced by a low, resonant, absolute calm that echoed cleanly off the tin ceiling. It was the frequency of a general delivering a casualty report. The actual locking mechanism is an electromagnetic maglock, rated for 1,200 pounds of holding force, installed directly into the steel doorframe. I continued, walking slowly down the central aisle, stepping casually over the spreading pool of blood surrounding Henderson's motionless body. It is wired to a secondary, closed-circuit breaker located in the basement. You cannot shoot it open. You cannot force it open. Diego's hand instantly dropped from the door handle, moving with blinding speed toward the lapel of his overcoat. I wouldn't, I advised, not breaking my slow, measured stride. The perimeter glass is polycarbonate ballistic paneling. Level 3. You authorized the purchase order yourself 18 months ago, under Vanguard Holdings, to ensure the incubator was protected from stray rural violence. You built a very expensive, very secure box, Mateo. Mateo's jaw locked. The muscles flexed visibly beneath his olive skin. He didn't look at the door. He looked at the woman walking toward him, analyzing the flawless, unblinking symmetry of my gaze. Diego, Mateo murmured, the command sharp, stripped of its previous languid arrogance. Diego drew the heavy, matte black handgun from his shoulder holster, pivoting entirely to face me, the muzzle leveling squarely at the center of my chest. Put the child down, I instructed, my eyes flicking briefly to Diego's massive forearm. Lily was still sitting on his arm, her small hands resting in her lap. She looked at the gun in Diego's hand, then looked at me. "The bird is out, Mommy?" Lily asked, her high, clear voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room. "The bird is out. Me Alma," I confirmed, a microscopic, genuine warmth softening the edge of my voice for a fraction of a second. "Stand by the window." That. Lily didn't wait for Diego to lower her. She twisted her small body, slipping smoothly off his arm, dropping the 2 feet to the linoleum floor with the agile grace of a cat. She didn't run toward me. She didn't seek cover. She walked calmly to the frosted front window, exactly as instructed, placing herself outside the immediate line of fire. Diego's eyes darted between the child and me, the tactical processor in his brain struggling to comprehend the absolute lack of panic in a 5-year-old walking away from a loaded weapon. "What is this, Maya?" Mateo asked. The silken, manipulative purr was completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, metallic scrape. He took a half step away from the door, his posture shifting into a hypervigilant, defensive stance. "This," I said, stopping exactly 15 feet away from them, "is the termination of the incubation period." I reached my left hand into the deep, front pocket of my faded denim apron. I didn't pull out the rusted .38 revolver Diego had confiscated. I pulled out a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch USP compact. The matte black finish absorbed the harsh fluorescent light. My crushed right hand hung uselessly by my side, but my left hand gripped the weapon with absolute, flawless isometric stability. I raised the barrel, aligning the tritium sights directly with the bridge of Diego's nose. Diego didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of his unsuppressed weapon shattered the air. He missed. He didn't miss because his aim was flawed. He missed because exactly 1/10 of a second before his finger broke the sear, I dropped my center of gravity, pivoting my left shoulder downward in a precise, calculated slip. The heavy hollow point round tore through the empty space where my chest had been, violently shattering the glass of the pie case behind me. I didn't blink at the sound. I squeezed the trigger of the USP twice. The suppressed weapon coughed, 2 sharp, metallic thwips. The first round took Diego in the right bicep, severing the brachial artery and shattering the humerus bone. The kinetic impact violently spun his massive frame to the side, his weapon discharging wildly into the acoustic ceiling tiles. The second round caught him perfectly in the side of his thick neck, directly beneath the jawline. Diego's eyes widened, a massive, uncomprehending shock freezing his features. He didn't grunt. The arterial spray painted the frosted glass of the front door in a sudden, violent arc of bright crimson. His massive legs simply ceased to function. He collapsed backward, hitting the linoleum with a devastating, heavy thud that shook the entire building. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his massive chest heaving once, twice, before the light permanently extinguished from his dark eyes. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. The silence that rushed back into the diner was absolute, heavy, and dripping with the metallic stench of fresh blood and cordite. I kept the suppressed weapon raised, shifting the muzzle exactly 6 inches to the right, locking it directly onto the center of Mateo's chest. Mateo had not drawn a weapon. He stood perfectly still, his bespoke cashmere coat speckled with the fine, red mist of his enforcer's arterial blood. He looked down at Diego's massive, lifeless body on the floor. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes to meet mine. The bottomless, obsidian voids were no longer observing an experiment. They were looking at an apex predator that had perfectly camouflaged itself as prey. "You missed the headshot on the first round," Mateo observed, his voice a low, vibrating whisper, attempting to maintain the facade of absolute control while the architecture of his reality violently collapsed around him. "I was compensating for the recoil with my non-dominant hand," I replied, my voice a flat, deadened echo in the bloody room. "And I needed to neutralize his firing arm instantly to prevent a reactionary spray toward the window. The second round was fatal. The tactical objective was achieved." Mateo's jaw tightened. He looked at the flawless, unwavering grip of my left hand. He looked at my posture, the cold, deadened symmetry of my eyes. "Who trained you to shoot like that?" Mateo breathed, the terrifying realization finally creeping into the edges of his voice. "My father," I answered, the 2 words dropping like anvils onto the linoleum. Mateo's brow furrowed, his mind frantically scrolling through the dossiers, the background checks, the meticulous surveillance reports he had compiled over 5 years. Your father was a high school mathematics teacher in Guadalajara, Mateo recited, clinging desperately to the fabricated reality he believed he controlled. He died of pancreatic cancer when you were 19. CHA. A cold, humorless ghost of a smile touched the corner of my mouth. My father, I corrected softly, the sheer gravity of the revelation pressing the remaining oxygen from the room, was Hector Valenzuela. The color completely drained from Mateo's flawless, olive skin. His lips parted slightly, the absolute, crushing shock paralyzing his facial muscles. For the first time in the 4 years I had known him, the untouchable, omnipotent architect of the Sinaloa cartel looked genuinely, profoundly terrified. Hector Valenzuela. The ghost of Juarez. The ghost of Juarez. The rival cartel boss that Mateo's syndicate had spent a decade hunting. The man who had orchestrated the ambush that took Mateo's left eye and left him with the glass prosthetic he now wore. The man Mateo believed he had successfully assassinated in a compound raid 6 years ago. Hector's bloodline was eradicated, Mateo rasped, stepping backward until his shoulder blades hit the heavy, sealed glass of the front door. I stood in the compound. I counted the bodies. You counted the bodies of his lieutenants, I corrected smoothly, maintaining the absolute lock on his chest. My father was a paranoid man. He knew the raid was coming. He sent me away to a safe house in Guadalajara 3 years prior, under a fabricated identity. The quiet, unremarkable daughter of a dying mathematics teacher. He trained me in the dark. He taught me how to shoot. He taught me how to sever the pain receptors. He taught me how to disappear. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my boots crushing the shattered glass of the Maker's Mark bottle. When you killed him, Mateo, I didn't run to the police. I didn't try to rally the remnants of his syndicate. I knew I couldn't fight you from the outside. Your walls were too high. Your security grid was impenetrable. Ev. I took another step. The distance between us was now 10 feet. So, I came to you. Mateo's eyes widened, the dark voids cracking, splintering under the weight of the massive, multi-year deception. The night we met, Mateo whispered, the memory suddenly recontextualized into a nightmare. The charity gala in Mexico City. A calculated intersection, I confirmed. I studied your psychological profile. I knew you were arrogant. I knew you possessed a god complex. But you desired things that were fragile, beautiful, and completely submissive. I manufactured the perfect victim. I let you court me. I let you bring me into the deepest, most secure sector of your compound. I let you believe you owned every breath I took. By the pregnancy, he breathed, his eyes darting to Lily standing quietly by the window, watching the exchange with unblinking fascination. The ultimate insurance policy, I stated, the clinical detachment of the strategy masking the profound, terrifying reality of what I had done. I knew that an assassination inside your compound would result in my immediate death. The security was too tight. I needed to isolate you. I needed you to step outside the fortress, entirely exposed. I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to absorb the absolute totality of his failure. But you never moved without an army, I continued, my voice a low, rhythmic hum. Unless it involved your legacy. A man with a god complex will not allow his bloodline to exist outside his control. So, I orchestrated the escape. I approached Arturo. I knew Arturo was reporting to you. I intentionally used the ghost routes I knew your surveillance network monitored. I wanted you to track me. Mateo pressed his hands against the cold glass of the door behind him, his chest heaving. The illusion of his omnipotence had been entirely stripped away, leaving a desperate, cornered man in a bespoke suit. You let me buy this building, Mateo concluded, the terrifying architecture of my trap finally coming into focus. I forced you to buy this building, I corrected softly. I hacked the regional bank's localized server to flag Henderson's loan for immediate foreclosure, leaving a digital breadcrumb trail explicitly designed for your financial auditors to find. I knew you wouldn't let your incubator become homeless. You bought the property. You authorized the security upgrades. You paid for the reinforced steel walls, the ballistic glass, the heavy mag locks. I raised the barrel of the USP a fraction of an inch, aligning it directly between his eyes. You built the perfect kill box, Mateo. And you paid for the privilege. Mateo looked around the blood-soaked diner. The shattered pie case, the dead enforcer, the heavy steel reinforced doors. He had believed he was constructing a terrarium to protect his asset. He had actually been financing his own execution chamber. The blizzard, Mateo whispered, looking at the thick, howling whiteout conditions pressing against the ballistic glass. The final variable, I confirmed. I've been monitoring the meteorological data for 3 weeks. The pass will be closed for at least 8 hours. The local sheriff, the man you believed was on your payroll, is actually an old associate of my father's. I intercepted your weekly surveillance payments 3 years ago. The reports you received were written entirely by me. Mateo's breathing was rapid, shallow, a ragged wheeze that tore from his throat. The apex predator had finally realized he was standing at the bottom of the pit, staring up at the spikes. You raised my daughter to be a monster, Mateo hissed, a desperate, feral attempt to reclaim some semblance of authority, his eyes darting toward Lily. She is Cardenas. See. She is Cardenas. She is a. She didn't flinch when Diego died. She didn't flinch when I grabbed your throat. You cannot rewrite her genetics. I didn't look at Lily. I kept my eyes locked on the broken man against the door. She didn't flinch when Diego died, Mateo, because she has watched me execute simulated threat neutralization drills in the basement of this diner for 3 years. I said, the cold truth landing like a physical blow. She didn't flinch when you grabbed my throat because she knew it was part of the timeline. I told her exactly what you would do. I told her exactly what to draw when you sat at the booth. Mateo's jaw went slack. The absolute, chilling realization that the 4-year-old child he believed was his perfect, sociopathic mirror was actually a highly trained operative participating in his assassination. She is not a Cardenas, I whispered, stepping forward until the suppressor of the USP was exactly 12 inches from the bridge of his nose. She is a Valenzuela. And she was the bait. Mateo stared down the dark, hollow barrel of the weapon. The arrogance. The manipulative charm. The cold, calculating voids of his eyes were completely gone. He was stripped bare, a terrified man waiting for the dark. Maya, wait. Mateo choked out, his hands raising defensively, trembling violently against the glass. You don't have to do this, you have the upper hand. We can negotiate. The accounts. The territory. I can transfer absolute control. You can have the syndicate. I don't want your syndicate, Mateo, I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial, absolute zero. I want the ghost of my father to sleep. Maya, please. I didn't let him finish the plea. I pulled the trigger. The suppressed weapon coughed. A single, sharp thwip. The 9mm hollow point round entered exactly half an inch above the bridge of his nose, directly between his dark, terrified eyes. The kinetic impact drove the back of his skull violently against the ballistic glass of the door. The reinforced polycarbonate didn't shatter, it absorbed the blunt force, leaving a thick, dark smear of crimson and gray matter sliding slowly down the frosted pane. Mateo Cardenas did not collapse immediately. His central nervous system severed, his body remained pinned against the door for a microscopic second, suspended by the architecture of the cage he had built. Then, his knees buckled. He slid down the glass, a slow, heavy collapse of bespoke wool and dead flesh, coming to rest in a crumpled, motionless heap directly beside the massive body of his enforcer. The architect of my nightmares was finally dead. The silence that reclaimed the diner was profound, absolute, and utterly deafening. The ticking of the analog clock above the shattered pie case sounded like a sledgehammer striking an anvil. I stood in the center of the linoleum aisle, my left arm still fully extended, the smoking barrel of the USP locked on the motionless bodies. I didn't lower the weapon immediately. I waited, allowing the tactical processor to verify the termination of all kinetic threats in the sector. 60 seconds. The bodies did not move. I slowly lowered my arm, the heavy weapon hanging by my side. The adrenaline that had sustained the psychological amputation finally began to metabolize, a rapid, toxic crash that sent a violent shudder through my spine. The localized pain in my crushed right hand roared back to life, a blinding, white-hot agony that forced a sharp, ragged gasp from my lungs. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back toward the tin ceiling. I breathed in the heavy, metallic stench of the slaughterhouse, letting it fill my lungs. It was the scent of absolute, undeniable freedom. "Mommy." The high, clear voice cut through the silence. I opened my eyes and turned my head. Lily was standing by the front window, exactly where I had told her to wait. She was looking at the bodies piled against the door. She looked at the blood pooling across the linoleum, creeping toward the toes of her small sneakers. Then, she looked up at me. She didn't look terrified. She didn't look traumatized. She looked at the blood on my face, the crushed, purple mass of my right hand, and the heavy weapon in my left. She walked slowly toward me, stepping carefully over the expanding pools of crimson, navigating the slaughter with the same quiet, meticulous precision she used to color her drawings. She stopped in front of me. She reached out her small hand, her fingers gently wrapping around the fabric of my faded denim apron. "The snake is dead," Lily stated, her pale, ice-gray eyes looking up into mine, perfectly calm, entirely devoid of fear. I looked down at the daughter I had raised in the dark. The daughter I had conditioned to be the bait for a monster. The daughter who had inherited the blood of two rival syndicates, possessing an architecture of violence that terrified even me. I dropped the USP onto the linoleum. It clattered sharply against the floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the pain, and wrapped my good arm around her small, rigid body, pulling her tightly against my chest. I buried my face in her thick yellow sweater, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and crayon wax, a desperate attempt to anchor myself back to the humanity I had just systematically dismantled. "Yes, mi alma," I whispered into her hair, my voice finally breaking, the tears sliding hot and fast down my dust-covered cheeks. "The snake is dead." Lily didn't cry. She rested her small chin on my shoulder, her ice-gray eyes staring blankly at the crumpled form of the cartel boss lying against the door. She reached up, her small hand gently patting the back of my neck in a slow, rhythmic, comforting motion. "It's okay, Mommy," Lily murmured, her voice a soft, chilling echo in the bloody room. "We can build a new cage now." I squeezed my eyes shut, the cold, terrifying reality of her words sinking deep into my bones as the blizzard howled against the reinforced glass.